Welcome everyone to Back to the Future, Prophetically Imagining the Online Church. This is the inaugural event for the Center for Spirituality and Media. I am Christine Lund, Principal Dean of Martin Luther University College, and I want to welcome you this afternoon. I'm grateful that Luther can partner with the Eastern Synod of the Evangelical Lutheran Church in Canada to create this Center for Spirituality and Media. While spirituality and media have always been connected, it seems that given our current experience of the pandemic, many of us have been acutely aware of this connection over the last 16 months. So I am really looking forward to this afternoon's presentation and also the many ways in which this center will support conversation in this field going forward. Before we begin our presentation this afternoon, it is important to acknowledge that while we are gathered in this mediated space, Luther is situated on the traditional territories of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and Neutrals peoples. For thousands of years, this land was inhabited by Indigenous people before the settlers had arrived. And this land acknowledgement recognizes the many ways in which the treaties have not been offered with these peoples. And it is Luther's commitment to continue to work for just relationships with our Indigenous neighbors. So again, thank you for joining us today. And I invite Deacon Sherry Coman, the director of the Center for Spirituality and Media, to say a few words.
Thank you, Chris. Hello and welcome. It's such a pleasure and a joy to be together for this inaugural event of the Center for Spirituality and Media. I think most of you know who I am. I am a newly ordained deacon in the Eastern Synod of the Evangelical Lutheran Church in Canada. I'm also an associate professional faculty here at Luther, and I also create and curate the Lutherans Connect online devotions. But you may not know that I have also taught film production, media studies, visual communications, and media theory at Humber College for the last 11 years. So this center very much brings together all of my passions. As you heard, the center is a joint project of both Luther and the Eastern Synod, and it's a collaboration, the word of the future. And I am so grateful to those who have helped to bring this together, particularly Bishop Mike Price and Christine, the Principal Dean, for their incredible support. I've also just really enjoyed the conversations we've had in bringing the center forward. The center is being supported by the Bishop's Company Fund of the Eastern Synod, and we are blessed by this. I'm grateful to Mark Harris, to Alan Jorgensen, whose idea this was way back when, about a year ago, to Mirko Petricevic for his assistance today, and to my colleague Debbie Ludolf, who will be gathering questions that you may wish to pose in the chat during today's conversation. And we hope to sort of begin talking about those questions around the 2:45 mark. So today's event is just a simple conversation, okay? It's no big media fireworks. This is the first of what I hope will be a cool conversation events series. My vision is of a kind of coffee lounge with guests and friends of Luther and the Synod, like a podcast, only live. And over time, it will have a variety of media involved. My hope is that once a month or so, we can gather with interesting and diverse guests and speakers to learn more about being disciples of Jesus in the increasingly mediated age of the church. The center will host media skill building workshops, exhibitions of media art, and events that help us to discern a way forward, like the one taking place on June 1st, called Okay, What Next?, which I will talk about more at the end of our time. Welcome to the Center for Spirituality and Media. It's my pleasure to introduce my guests. Dr. Tim Hutchings is a sociologist of digital religion, working in a field, and these are his words, and I deliberately am using them because I love the way he's put this, in a field known as religion, media, and culture, which emerges at the intersection between sociology of religion, media studies, cultural studies, media philosophy, and theology. The key starting point, these are his words, for scholars in this field is that we cannot talk about religion and media as two separate things. Religion is always mediated and can even be understood as a kind of media. We could unpack that for the next hour, actually, but anyway. He studied online churches for about 15 years, including a PhD and a wonderful book called Creating Church Online, Ritual, Community, and New Media. His research has also included attention to digital grief, Bible apps, and Christian video games. He's the editor-in-chief of the Journal of Religion, Media, and Digital Culture. Welcome, Tim. Matthew Anderson is no stranger to those among us, I think. He's been an ordained pastor of the ELCIC for 36 years. He is affiliate professor in the Department of Theological Studies at Concordia University in Montreal, living that reality remotely right now in Nottingham, England. He's a scholar of New Testament and early Christianity and pilgrimage. He's also a filmmaker of 2 short documentaries. And during the pandemic, he's been podcasting pilgrimage stories from up and down the staircase, which I would so recommend you check out. He blogs, including blogging on his long distance walking to bring attention to Indigenous and treaty territories. This summer, he is going to bring out a book called The Bible and Booze, which sounds so promising. And we will likely see him again then, actually. Welcome, Matthew. So gentlemen, let's get started. Tim, in your book, you have written this wonderful sentence. By studying the futures of the past, we can find insights that help us make sense of the futures being offered to us today. So my question is, what is the future of the past that you think we can benefit most from right now?
Thank you, Sherry, and thank you for inviting me. So that was a sentence that I wrote as I was reflecting on what had been my PhD research and working out how to turn it into a book. Because at that point, I felt like I was confronted with a problem, really. I'd started out studying online churches when, for a British audience, they were quite new. They'd attracted lots of media publicity. And journalists were writing about online churches because they were supposed to be the future. They were the coming thing. It was time for denominations to start investing in the internet because this is where worship was about to happen. And as I studied these groups, I picked out 5 large groups and I spent time with them over a number of years, turned that into a PhD. And it became clear that this was actually probably not going to be the future in quite the way people had anticipated. The predictions of the 90s and the early 2000s of a completely digital future world hadn't come to pass in the same way as the predictions of the paperless office, for example, never quite came to reality. So I started thinking, so what is it that I've got here in these stories that I think still needs to be shared? And I came to realize what I got was a story about the future. It was the future we thought we were going to get in the early 90s and the 1980s and the early 2000s. And those innovations in online church had been motivated partly by seeing the potential of media, but partly by this dream about the future and what kind of future were we going to get. Moving into a university environment, we're still being persuaded, compelled to change all of the time by promises about the future. I've talked about this sometimes as a kind of radical conformity. There'll be regular messages that come through saying we have to change everything we do because we're 2 years behind the curve and everybody else has done it already and our students are expecting this. We've got to change everything in order to be the same as everybody else. And that kind of message has been heard a lot in the churches as well, I think. I've spoken over recent years to people who are often not, sometimes excited, sometimes quite worried about messages they were getting from their church leaders to say every church has to be online, every church service has to be online. We expect everything to be broadcast all of the time. So one thing we can learn from studying the past of the future, or the future of the past, is to take a step back from those big claims. If someone comes to us and says, we've got to change everything we're doing because in the future everything will be like this, take those thoughts with a pinch of salt, I guess. Try to analyze, where are those dreams coming from? How do we know that this is what the future is going to be like and that this is what we have to do? But I also think my study of the history of the future has turned up some points that Christian audiences have found very resonant, speaking in a number of venues over the last few years. One is just knowing how old the online church is. One of the stories is the kind of radical conformity. We have to all do this because it's the way things are going to be done. But you'll also find that innovations in online spirituality are often presented as though they were a very new thing. Right up until just before the pandemic, you were still finding news stories boasting that someone had created the first ever online church. And that just wasn't true. You can find traces of Christians involved in online ministry going right back into the 1980s. So as far back as you find computers networked together, there are Christians using that for ministry. I don't think that's too much of an exaggeration. There's records of a service of worship and remembrance held after the Challenger space shuttle disaster in the 1980s. So you can see Christians involved in using computer networks for spiritual purposes right at the very, very origins of those networks. Christians belong in these spaces, and that's a helpful message sometimes for churches today to hear. And I'd also think one other vision to kind of take back from the past is who is excited, who gets to determine this future? Who is excited about this? If you go back to those kind of early origins of digital spirituality, the people who are active there are often, calling them the outcasts of the church is perhaps going a bit too far, but they're people on the margins of institutional power in the churches. They are disabled people, often very elderly people, housebound people, people in isolated rural communities. There are, in the origin stories of computer technologies, there are lots and lots of women, LGBTQ communities, people of color, people whose stories actually got erased as the internet became more commercially viable. And there's at least a potential that the same thing is happening in our current pandemic situation. Of course, my anxieties writing my book just a few years ago think, well, why would anyone be interested in online church? Well, now everybody wants to know about it. It's suddenly become as mainstream as it's possible to be. And I think one thing that could have been lost, perhaps, in that rush to mainstream the church is some of those early hopes and dreams. Do we recognize, or do you recognize in your churches that the pioneers of online spirituality are disabled people, elderly people, it's in some cases people who applied for ministry in their churches and were turned down and went online instead to set up their own communities? Those are the people who are the experts. Those are the people who could be leading the church right now, not necessarily the big kind of institutions who might like to give the impression that they always knew what was going on. So that's a few lessons I think we can learn.
Yes, that's fantastic. Thank you. It's so much to reflect on there. I mean, the internet has always been a democratizer. You know, from its inception, it has set up an equality because anybody can claim space in it. Anybody can make space in it. But I love what you're saying about the way in which the church, the online church, can conceivably draw from its marginalized members going forward as in terms of greater leadership. That there's an aspect of online church that actually improves the opportunities for that. That's wonderful. Matthew, in our preliminary conversation, you said that you felt that right now we are positively disrupting, so I'm using, disrupting in a positive way, our sense of the importance of church buildings. Can you say a bit more about what you mean by that?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. And thanks. It's nice to be here. It's nice to see so many familiar faces, by the way, as well. Hi from England to everyone. Positive disruption. Technology always brings a disruption. And the adoption of technology always brings some disruption. And that's what Tim's just been talking about. So I just will follow on in terms of some of the things that Tim has just said. And those disruptions, I think, in terms of church buildings can be positive. You said, when you were introducing me, you noted that I've been a pastor for 36 years. Well, I think out of 4 congregations that I was in, 3 of them had problems with their churches. We had to sell a number of churches and move to other places. And in many cases, and this is going to be familiar to lots of clergy out there who are in buildings, the building has the congregation has shrunk. The building has outgrown the congregation. One of the things that takes the most time in church congregational council meetings or parish meetings is the building committee, the upkeep, the maintenance. How do we have enough of a budget to repair the brickwork, to do whatever it needs to be doing, to replace the roof? And a person spends so long on those physical things, which are part of the body, a part of the institution, but that it sort of sucks all of the energy and time away from this limited group of volunteers. So I've experienced that again and again in the parish. And it seems to me that the forced move to digital that has happened with the pandemic has been a positive disruption, because it's allowed, in some ways, many of us to see how we look apart from always being in the building. And I'm not at all saying, just following again on Tim, not at all saying that, of course, it's all going to be a wholesale move over to digital. No, not at all. But it was interesting. There was an article today in the media by a scholar from the University of Saskatchewan talking to the government and basically saying, why do all federal jobs have to be in the Ottawa area? And basically it was saying, why don't we move some of these civil service jobs out to many, many other places? And they were saying it reduces cynicism against the federal government, it saves money, and it strengthens the unity of the country. And those are strong arguments. And so what's happened, the technology has been a bit of a disruptor in terms of the civil service. And this person is calling and saying, this is something new that we can do. And so how can the pandemic and the technological push that it's given? So for instance, my wife, Sarah Parks, her parents are sort of Presbyterian Baptists who go to church every week in their own church. And they're used to Facebook. Like a lot of people, they know how to use Facebook, but anything else, pretty much they get lost. And what has the pandemic done? It has allowed them, it has pushed them to learn how to use platforms like Zoom and other platforms. And it has allowed them to engage with their own congregation in a different way. And so what's happened is this technology is not new by any stretch, but whether in the university or in government or in business, in downtown Montreal, I know is emptying out in some ways in terms of the business real estate, or now in the church, it's pushed people into a new paradigm, or at least to experiment with it. And it doesn't mean that people aren't going to come back to the churches, but it means that there's going to be this new way, and maybe we will be less tied to the church as a result, I think. It'll maybe move us from talking about what are Lutheran congregations or what is the Lutheran Church as an institution to what is Lutheran tradition? What is Lutheran life? What does it mean to walk through the world with that particular flavor of being in the body of Christ, and disrupt the relationship to a special building in some way? I mean, I think we should be all about place all the time, but not necessarily always about that specific bricks and mortar. So,
yeah, that's great. That's an awesome answer. Yes, I attended last week a conference of the European Christian Internet Church, and there was some conversation there about collaboration and between specialists specialists who have an expertise in certain kinds of, say, virtual reality or augmented reality, but aren't necessarily churched, and having partnerships with them and traditions, as you've named, the tradition of the Lutheran Church or whatever, and in sort of piloting what might be possible for sort of innovative ways of gathering. And it was interesting because in the virtually real space that they shared with us, there wasn't necessarily aspects of church architecture represented. There were some sort of suggestions of it, but there were other kinds of architecture as well that in some ways made also some sense. But that's a whole other conversation, and one I hope to have in the future in the center. Tim, I was thinking that maybe we could tease out some definitions. The difference between the online church and the church online, and where the virtual church fits into that.
Thank you. So it's a set of terms that I've derived from a Canadian scholar, Chris Hedlund, who perhaps some of you will have come across. But he talked right back in the year 2000, I think, about a distinction between religion online and online religion, which even then, it seemed like a very powerful typology that could actually mean a few different things. He was talking about a difference between institutional hierarchical religion that wants to use the internet to continue the way things work by just sending out information to people, versus online religion, which he saw as a kind of grassroots, non-hierarchical participation in religious activities. And part of that is quite a kind of a value judgment to say the internet is not designed for hierarchies. The internet will make online religion flourish, and people trying to do religion online are going to struggle. And of course, you know, right away, as you listening to this are probably thinking, people started to see this was really going to be a continuum. There are lots of hierarchical organizations that do opportunities online for people to participate in religious activities. And there are lots of kind of grassroots groups that share information. But for some reason, that idea that there might be two different ways of doing religion in digital spaces, one that's more hierarchical and one that's more grassroots, has persisted in one way or another. And if you adapt that to online churches, I think we can come back to something Sherry mentioned just a minute ago about the internet being a kind of inherent democratizing force. Because that's true, but it's half the story. Yeah. In quite in a way that it took people sometimes a few years to recognize. On the one hand, if you look historically at how Christians have used the internet, there's this early flourishing of online churches where groups of people come together and they do very anarchic and unpredictable and strange and experimental things with nobody in charge of them whatsoever. And actually over time, the traditional institutional church took over a lot of that energy and kind of took back control. Just in the same way as you could see early online communities are quite anarchic and democratic, and then Facebook kind of institutionalizes everything and takes back control. And now maybe your churches are doing really interesting community things on Facebook, but there's one company that owns all of that space and gets to set the rules. So when I was writing my book about online churches, I was thinking about a shift from online church maybe back to church online, where I could see the groups that I'd spent a few years with in the early 2000s and the mid 2000s, they were still going, they were still around, but the ones that were really getting lots of, hundreds of thousands of viewers were run by hierarchical traditional churches in a much more controlled way. But we could see an extra point that we can add to that typology at the moment, I'd say. We've got church online and we've got online church, but we're now living in a pandemic environment, which you might call online church, perhaps.
Online church.
It's the church that has been forced online. It actually, we're not really the church choosing to do something in a grassroots way or launching a kind of institution-backed experiment, but the church that just gets thrown into the online space, finds itself online and is kind of scrambling to work out what to do next. And that's new. We haven't had that before. That could really change the way that online religion develops in the future.
I mean, I think that's fantastic. I also think that, you know, I know as having been part of a worship team over the past year at Luther, that there is actually what I would call grassroots development in creativity. It's more of a creativity exploration. And so, excuse me. And so I find that we learned from experimenting in that creativity. And so I would call that a kind of grassroots. I think that kind of creativity is going on a lot in terms of how people are experimenting with what to do, but that's a lot to reflect on there. I want to do that. Matthew, I think this is a good moment for this. We were also talking among us about the importance of naming the fears that we have right now. How does fear participate in our sense of imagining the future?
Well, the people of God have always moved out best when they've had their back against the wall. Sometimes, unfortunately, we haven't always, heeded the call of the Spirit. In fact, it's interesting that we should be having this. I'm not sure if this was on purpose, that we should be having this inauguration of the center, 3 days after Pentecost. Because what happens is you've got disciples locked in a room, and of course they're locked in from the inside. They are the ones who lock the door, according to the Book of Acts. And what happens? They receive the Spirit, they go out, and they can't communicate the message except in multiple tongues given them by the Spirit. So there's a very rich tradition that we've just been witness to in the liturgical life of our churches about how this dynamic of closing oneself in to a space, saying we don't know the way forward, receiving the Spirit that allows us to go out in a way that we never have before. And it seems to me that, I completely agree. I mean, it's not I don't want to say that digital media are in any way some sort of a new solution to everything by any stretch. For one thing, it's not that new, as Tim has been pointing out. And the other thing is that it tends to, it's like Foucault, some of you, if you want the theoretical background, Michel Foucault talks about how place is always where power is exercised. Mm-hmm. And we've seen this with, in terms, as you were just talking about, in terms of the web, companies like Facebook or Amazon increasingly, or Apple, are controlling sections of the web like property, essentially. And so they are exercising power within those new places. So the question was about fear. And it seems to me that a little fear keeps us on our edge, and it allows us to sort of to move out in a way. There's a professor at Concordia who's a musicologist, and he talked in one of my classes one time I was teaching a class about the history of the 20th century, I think. I'm not sure what it was, about the history of the 20th century. And he's a musicologist, and he came and he said, did you know that the start of FM radio was the end of the hit that the whole world heard? And I said, what do you mean? And he said, basically, as soon as you get digital radio stations, you get the division into niche markets of everybody, R&B is here, hip hop is here, Frank Sinatra's here, everybody's all the way along the line. And he said that's the end of one radio hit that everybody on AM radio heard. And I think we've been living the consequences of that kind of digitization, for good or ill, both ways, ever since. I had a chat years ago. I don't know if the Synod staff are still around. And I don't think Rita Hepelmäki would mind my saying this. I'm not sure. But Rita Hepelmäki and I had a discussion when I first started at St. Michael's Finnish Church in Montreal. And she, being a Finn, came in and said, St. Michael should just, at some point, you should all become English and just join an English congregation or start an English ministry, and that should be it. And me, as a Canadian who's not Finnish at all, said, no, absolutely not. It's particularly it's the Finnish that makes that congregation unique. And it's that strange combination of Finnish and English. So what is that? In one sense, that's kind of a niche. It's a kind of digital can help us, and it certainly does online. Think of all of the people who express themselves as Comic-Con artist people, or they have a thing about turtles, for heaven's sakes. Maybe they collect turtles. I don't know what, but they find a community online. And so can we use this new technology? Can we overcome our fears to move away from the kind of plain white bread that so often Lutheranism has been accused of, to find whatever our particular flavors are that, that we can express in terms of that spirituality. I think it can happen. It doesn't always, but I think it can. And if we stick to too strict a definition of church, we don't realize that, just as Tim said, there's always been different levels. I mean, I remember my grandfather always said on Sunday mornings, I'm going to go to church. He only ever went, like we'd be driving away from church and he would be driving to church on his way to go for the coffee hour. For him, that was going to church. And yet, could we say he wasn't going there for church? He went every Sunday. He just got up late and went for the coffee hour. There have always been people who've participated in different ways, it seems to me. And part of the overcoming of the fear is to realize that it's a new technology that will change things, but will also allow growth in terms of have its own dangers, I think. So
that's awesome. And yes, this is a Pentecost event.
It is. Yeah.
I think for me, I was reading. So Nadia Boltz-Weber and her community have online churches. They have something called the Chapel and the Corners and so on. And I was reading her homily on Pentecost, and she was saying that one of the things that really leapt out of her, at her from the scripture was that disciples were all gathered in one place. And for her, that was a profound thing she had heard, again, for the first time, of being gathered together in one place, and of course, meaning one physical place. And I appreciated that so much, but at the same time, I was thinking, we are all gathered in one place right now. It's an online place. It's a different kind of place. And possibly more importantly, we're gathered at one time. We're gathered in the same moment. I think in some ways, faith communities online increase our appreciation for being in the moment, or they can also encourage us to check out, to be doing something else at the same time or whatever. But I think we always did that in church anyway. Also, speaking for myself, sometimes when I was not always completely invested in worship, sometimes my mind was traveling. So I think that I thought that it would be interesting to try to do this at a time when we've been when the church is renewing its sense of purpose in the year, the calendar of the church year. So Tim, I was also struck by something that I know you've done this work, which is on digital grief. And I know that there is a great deal of it. And I'm wondering if you could just say more about what that means to you and how you're observing it right now.
So something that has come up a few times now in this conversation is the way that the internet and digital culture gives space to new voices to talk in new ways. And people who study death and dying and grief in Western societies have noted for a very long time a kind of a closing down, a privatizing of grief, a reluctance to speak in public about grief and bereavement, which was challenged by the internet. From the 90s and the early 2000s again, people started to go online and talk about experiences of grief and loss and bereavement that they couldn't perhaps talk to their friends and families about. Finding online communities of people who'd shared a very particular kind of loss, parents who've lost a child or children who've lost a parent. Setting up online memorials, perhaps, to remember people in ways that conventional culture wouldn't approve of. Friends setting up an online memorial to remember what their friends were really like, separate from being supervised by parents who might have a kind of particular vision of how that young person's legacy should be preserved. And one of the things that was noted about that explosion of online conversation about grief and loss was that a lot of it was actually quite religious in tone and language. There's a lot of talk online about angels, about heaven, about an afterlife, about being together again in the future. And there's very, very little academic research into that. There's a little bit, but not very much, particularly looking within religious communities. But we've certainly seen that Christian communities, when they've lost somebody, turn to digital media as one way of talking about their grief. And some people I know who have died have seen their dying online as a kind of ministry, talking through their journey with online audiences. And of course, what's happened over the last year or so is in some ways a kind of the ultimate privatizing of grief. We've been forbidden from sharing our grief publicly in large funerals, for example, in the way that we might have expected to be allowed to do a year or so ago. And that's been very, very difficult for lots of people. But we've found that digital culture has become the primary grief place, I think, for our society. So that's become the place where the constant loss of the last year and a half has been discussed every day. There have been some attempts to build online memorials, online grief spaces. There have been online memorials for a very long time of one kind or another. Social media becomes a place of memory and grief. But also in the UK, for example, St. Paul's Cathedral has set up a Remember Me page where they're encouraging everybody, particularly in the UK, but anyone who's lost, anyone who has died can be memorialized on that page, and they've got thousands and thousands of profiles turning up there now. So one thing that's very interesting for me as a sociologist of religion is to see how in a country like England that is in theory has a state church, to see the ways in which the Church of England does or does not actually play a central role in national memory. We have an annual Remembrance Day, for example, for the dead in world wars, and that is a very kind of religious-led occasion. Will that be the case for future COVID memorials? I don't know. I'm looking forward with my kind of research hat on to finding out. But certainly there are some attempts like this, and I'm sure some of the people listening will have been doing work like this. Many local churches have been trying to find ways to help their community grieve and remember what has happened. And digital space is one of the very few places that we've had available to us to do that over the recent period.
Yeah, and thank you. There's so much also to we could again pursue from that. I know that some people have found who've lost loved ones have found Facebook, for instance, to be a kind of living scrapbook in which they can experience the losses and also visit the memories by scrolling back down through the feed to see pictures and comments and things that have been posted there. Again, that's a whole area in itself that we could spend time on. I'm going to just ask one more question to Matthew before we go to the question and answer period. And I just wanted to kind of bring us to this place of, I'm fascinated by the work you're doing, Matthew, on pilgrimage. And particularly the work that you've done on pilgrimage since the pandemic started. I mean, I'm interested in all of it, not particularly, but for today's focus, I am particularly interested in, I think it's called Pilgrimage Up and Down the Staircase. What are the ways that you've found for encouraging people in their spirituality in your podcasts?
Well, the podcast resulted really from being shut into the house here in England at a time when it was particularly bad here in England, and realizing that I couldn't go on the walks. I mean, it's very frustrating to be so close to the Peaks District, which is such a wonderful area to walk, and not being able to do that. So the staircase has 13 stairs, and you go up and down. And at first I went up 25 times, and then 50, and then 75. And I realized at some point while I was going up and down, I was thinking about the walks that I'd taken in the past, whether in Norway. Chris Lund and I were on that trip together years ago, and Alan Jorgensen, who I think is there, and others, or in the Whithorn Way in Scotland, or in Treaty 4 and Treaty 6 on the prairies. And so I thought, what's a way of experiencing this and also sharing this experience during this time, and podcast. So I, fortunately, the Concordia University Part-Time Faculty Association is very generous with funding if you give them a good proposal. I gave them a proposal. I got a mic and professional earphones and everything else, and started saying, well, let's see if we can experience this. I saw that Martin Molina, I don't know if he's still there, but was in the group who was attending. And this idea of mediated pilgrimage is not a new thing. And I think Martin, if I recall correctly from seeing it on Facebook or somewhere, was intending to go on the Camino and de Santiago in Spain this last year. Obviously was not able to do that. And so what I think he and his wife did was that they walked areas around Ottawa where they were and kept track of the distance. That may seem like a new thing, and it was a new thing for Martin, I'm sure, but in the long history of pilgrimage, there has always been mediated pilgrimage. Cloistered monks and nuns would read travel accounts of voyages to the Holy Land and would paste that in their cells. So just to build on Tim's much earlier point, that things are always the new things are always have an antecedent. There's always a history behind these things. And virtual pilgrimage certainly has an antecedent. I see Patricia Genelia in Kelowna just popped up about labyrinths. Well, they are also a way of experiencing that pilgrimage. So I guess this digital thing that we've been pushed into, the digital shift that we've been increasingly pushed into, gives us an idea of how to express spirituality in old ancient ways, but in new forms. Is it the same old thing online? Which, I mean, some congregations are basically doing, filmed versions of their Sunday service. And there's nothing necessarily wrong with that if that's what people want. But others are doing, at the same time, others are going completely different directions and are maybe moving to, I remember Pastor Lyndon Sayers in Victoria was sharing prayers from his balcony or his front porch at one point, in Victoria, BC. And this was a completely different way of doing prayers. But he was sharing them and sort of looking around and saying, as I look at this tree, what are we praying about? So there are new ways, completely new ways of doing things as well. And I tried to do some of that in the podcast, Pilgrimage Stories from Up and Down the Staircase. And of course, for me, that's a particular interest, and that also comes out in that book that you mentioned. The whole title, by the way, is Pairings, the Bible and Booze. So the idea being that you take two completely different things and it's a mashup of a sort. But that's a different topic.
But I'm glad it's clarified. Thank you for clarifying that. That's great.
Yep.
Thank you so much, both of you. I realize this is a short space of time relatively, and we could and we have, but we could go on for quite some time. I do believe in keeping a kind of relatively tight framework for this kind of gathering, and so I would like to move now and turn the sort of leadership over to my colleague, Dr. Debbie Ludolf, who is the Dean of the Chapel at Luther and also has been spending a great deal of time over this past year working in mediated worship. And I think she is going to relay for us the questions that have been rising in the chat and for all of us for the panel.
Thanks, Sherry. And thanks for this rich conversation. We could be here many more hours. But there are some questions that have surfaced, and maybe just building on this idea of pilgrimage, Matthew, that you have been mentioning. One of the first questions was about embodiment. And how does body language, this is from Miranda, how does the body language of the leader change between standing at the altar versus sitting at a camera? And how do we keep the sense of liturgical movement over the elements in this new format? And Tim, you may have something there to offer too. I think that's one of the things that is nerve-wracking for people and that they're longing for again. You gave us some ideas. So what do we do with this embodiment piece that everybody's now in front of a screen?
Maybe I'll do a quick answer, and then if Tim has something to add to that as well. I'm not so sure. I'm very often in terms of digital. I think it's a great question, Miranda, by the way. I could see in the chat she was asking, or commenting, wonderful comments all the way throughout. So thank you for all of those. It seems to me that it's, again, too often we get into the binary. We go, it's either one or the other, when in fact, it's not going to be. It wasn't in the past, as Tim has pointed out, and it won't be in the future. And sometimes I think about hockey. You know, a lot of people love to go to the local rink to watch a hockey game. But they'll also on Saturday night watch the Leafs and the Habs. Yeah. And they're both hockey, but they're completely different experiences of the same game. And how is that going to, I think that's more what we're headed toward. Mm-hmm. And so the question about liturgical, about body language, there will probably be some way in which body language is expressed online or digitally, and a different way that it is obviously expressed. And of course, we all know that there are no two worship leaders or participants who express their body language in the same way anyway. So that same diversity is going to happen online or not. I'll pass it over to Tim in case he wants to say something else.
Great, thanks.
So there is a difference, of course. For example, the way that we've set this session up right now, we're all sitting quite close to our cameras. And instead of seeing our whole bodies, you're just seeing our faces. One comment I've heard from people I've interviewed is that there's actually something is really gained from bringing cameras and screens into worship, because for the first time you're looking right into the face of the person who's preaching to you. It's as if they're just talking to you one-to-one, which gives you a kind of intimate experience of worship that if you're at the back of a several hundred person church, you're not getting in the same way. But people find their own ways to bring their body into worship, even in digital settings. We should not assume that we're somehow disembodied just because we're looking on the screen right now. I've talked to people who dance and sing and light candles around the screen and put stickers on their laptops and all kinds of ways of trying to get the body into what they're doing. In some ways, the emphasis at the moment on video chat represses that, I think. If I was teaching, I would stand up and walk around, and I can't do that because we've got the screen on, so I'm talking to you like this. If we had our cameras off, I'd probably be using my body a lot more than I am right now. So I would say experiment. Think to yourself, we're not broadcasting the real church. We're trying to do church in a new media space. And you're going to have to figure out what works for you and your particular audience and your particular kind of theology, and what is the experience that is going to be meaningful for you as a group of people, and try out a bunch of different things and see what works, and be willing to keep changing it up until you find the perfect thing for your group.
Great.
We also, we bring ourselves, our whole selves, to everything that we do online. And it's a very intimate experience. It's a word I like to use. And I think to some extent, when we are more in both the church building spaces and online spaces with more ease, I think the loss of intimacy is going to be something that will impact some of the people who have been doing online worship. The fact that you can't see the pastor's eyes anymore, and or that particular smile, the fact that you can't put in the chat, great sermon. Nobody in traditional church worship, well, not nobody, there are whole communities of people who do this, but in the Lutheran tradition, we aren't known for jumping up at the end of sermons and going, great sermon, in the church building. So there will be some losses, I feel, when we're able to put our physical bodies into a physical space with each other, as well as however much there is also losses now.
Thank you. There are quite a few questions about the challenges of things like copyright, who is willing to be on screen, not on screen, big topics like what do we do about sacraments, and do we do them or not do them, all of those kinds of things. And we have like 2 minutes. So I'm going to say, if there's anything either of you would like to speak to around Matthew, you talked about the disruption, and there was a question around how do you balance that with anxiety? And I think what these other questions are reflecting is the anxiety of what we do as a community. So is there anything you'd like to offer, either of you, to finish that up around the challenges?
I'll just say very quickly that I think it's going to be evolutionary, of course, despite it being a disruption. And not everybody, despite the fact that our congregation, I think what's going to evolve will be that there will be, poor pastors will not have to do everything all the time for the foreseeable future, I don't think, and they shouldn't have to. So I think that this blended thing is going to move forward, but there may be more, maybe there will be more synodical ownership of the online worship piece or something, particularly even through the center for, that's being inaugurated today. I'll just leave it at that and pass it over to Tim.
Thank you.
I can see a comment that kind of comes off of the things that a few different people have said in the chat. If you look at how online church worked before the pandemic, it was almost always part of somebody's multiple Christian belonging. People were not choosing between doing church online or going to the local church. They were usually doing both. And if they weren't doing both, they had a very good reason for it, which was not laziness. It was disability, illness, remoteness, bad experiences of a local church, and they were going online to be safer, something like that. But most people were doing both, and they were doing that because they got different benefits out of, or they felt they had a different role in the local church and their online church. So online, you can find the best sermons in the world and work out what sermons you want to listen to that week. You can also find a community of people who will pray with you at 2 o'clock in the morning because there's somebody awake somewhere in the world at any moment. If you're looking for a really good theological discussion, no offense to the church people listening, but you'll probably find that online more easily than you'll find it in your local community. But the people I spoke to said they were going to still go to their local church because that's where they felt that they served or they worked. That's where they supported a community of people. Online, you can have huge amounts of discussion for emotional support, but there are also the volunteering roles that people do for their local community that they didn't want to give up. Mm-hmm. So we find people taking different parts of what they need for their Christian nourishment or their Christian identity or their Christian work and finding those in different places. And I think that comes back to a few questions that people have had about what's this going to look like after the pandemic. I'd expect it to go back to something like that, where people connect back into a local community, but they're still finding good discussions, great sermons, good music, other things in online spaces.
Thank you. Sherry.
Thank you, Debbie Lou. That was a fast hour. I am so grateful to Tim and to Matthew for your presence today. Thank you so much for being with us. It's been, I've made so many notes here that I want to think about. I'm also extremely grateful to all the people who are here and for your activity in the chat. I haven't had a chance to read everything, but I will. And I'm just very excited for the amount of connection that you are making in the chat with some of what's being said. So it will be very, very helpful as well in going forward in discerning the kinds of things we need to talk about and the kinds of events that we need to have. So I am very grateful, and please also feel free to write me at my email is on the webpage for the spiritual. For the center, which is spiritualityandmedia.ca. And you can reach me through there. And I'm always going to be interested to hear what you have to say. I also just want to, before we go completely, I want to also say that, we invite you at Luther to check out some of the future events that are going on here in the calendar section of our website, which is luther.wlu.ca. And there you'll find that there's quite a lot of opportunities and events and issues going on. We have other centers that are coming forward that will be opening as well, and just other really cool things happening. So I guess that's it for now. I'm going to once again just say again, thank you to everyone, and to Christine, and to everyone at the Synod office who's been helping as well, to Bishop Mike, and I think some of them had to leave early for a meeting, but thank you, and I hope to see you again very soon. Oh, we have an event next week. on June 1st called Okay, What Next? And this is, I think this is going to be, there's going to be a group of 6 of us doing leadership on that from the Synod and also from Luther. We are, oh, what happened to my notes on that? Where is it? Okay, yeah. Like today, it's going to be the first of a possible series of ongoing gatherings. We're going to be talking in a more focused way on developing sort of collaborative worship skills and some hybrid and a conversation, that word we need to talk about, and what it means and so on. And we're going to invite lay leaders to share some reflective conversation about their experiences, and some rostered leaders will have a chance to discuss possible ways of collaborating. And we're going to hear a case study from one worship leader on what has worked in the past. So I look forward to seeing you then a week today on June 1st. So thank you again. Have a good afternoon, and we'll see you soon. Bye-bye.